The first thing Helena did after leaving the hospital was wander aimlessly toward the city center. She wore borrowed clothes, a vacant look, and a hesitant step that seemed afraid of the ground itself. She stopped in front of a toy store and stood still for minutes, staring at a teddy bear in the window as if seeing a ghost. Hours later, she returned to Waverly State Hospital with disheveled hair and panic in her eyes. She shouted that she's still in there, pointing toward the back of the building, as if a long-dormant memory had kicked down the door of time. Security tried to restrain her, but she knelt on the asphalt and begged to be let back in, without explaining what or who she had left behind. Most dismissed the scene, chalking it up to another typical relapse. But a young nurse, new to the ward and attuned to subtle signs, found it too strange to ignore. And the deeper he delved into her case, the more he began to suspect that not everything was imagined. Waverly State Hospital was a weathered brick building, set apart from the urban center, surrounded by leafless trees and an eternal kind of silence. Helena arrived there at 22, brought by her older sister after a series of episodes no one could quite name. She cried without reason, spoke to herself at night, and drew blue doors on wrapping paper. The diagnosis came quickly, coldly, and definitively: schizoaffective disorder with dissociative episodes. The decision to commit her was made before anyone tried to understand what had actually happened. Her belongings were packed into a box labeled with just a number, and the door to the women's ward closed as if forever. In the early months, Helena kept her eyes open at night, watching the ceiling's cracked lights. She spoke little, but repeated disjointed names, as if trying to hold on to fragments of memory before they vanished. Some staff said she drew faces on napkins and hid them under her pillow. That's when the rumors began, about her fragile condition, and about a change in her body no one dared mention aloud. Her clothes grew looser, exams were postponed, and medical updates were unusually sealed. Helena was moved to a decommissioned wing under the pretense that she needed absolute silence. There, time passed without witnesses. The windows were always covered, meals slid through a slot, and visits grew increasingly rare. There was no contact with other patients, no fixed therapists, just the sound of her own footsteps echoing through cold tile. The few staff who knew about the pregnancy pretended not to, some out of fear, others out of blind obedience. Only one young nurse, recently hired, seemed disturbed by how pale and withdrawn Helena was becoming, as if she were being kept alive only by systematic denial. When she finally went into labor, it was during a blackout caused by a storm that cut the hospital off for hours. No ambulance could reach them, no obstetrician was called. Everything happened in shadows and whispers, and when the lights returned, the child was nowhere to be found. Helena's return that overcast afternoon hit the hospital like an unauthorized alarm. She appeared at the front gate barefoot, eyes glazed and breathing uneven. She muttered incoherent phrases while pointing to the rear of the building where the windows had been sealed for years. The security team hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to touch her, as if her presence carried something contagious. When they finally subdued her, she didn't scream or resist. She only whispered, like a mantra, that she's still in there. Doctors chalked it up to an early relapse and ordered temporary readmission. Helena was placed under observation with no visits and no release date. Her chart read reactive hallucination, recurring ideation, and regressive behavior. But to Nurse Isaac, it didn't seem like delusion. It seemed like something she refused to forget. Isaac was new to the ward, not yet trained to overlook subtle signs. Helena's behavior seemed less confused than painfully specific. He decided, on his own, to focus on the details others dismissed. He started with the words she kept repeating, "in there." With each shift, Isaac dug deeper into the hospital's old files, stored in dusty boxes in the basement. In an outdated blueprint, he found a reference to Wing 9B, psychiatric containment. It appeared on no current maps, And it was precisely in the direction Helena had pointed. With quiet help from a janitor, he discovered there was still an old key for that wing. The next night, after the hospital had quieted down, he walked to the back and unlocked the door that seemed sealed by time. The latch gave with difficulty. The smell inside was one of mold and abandoned childhood. The room was small, with faded light blue walls. In the center, an iron crib, thick with dust. There was also a rust-stained chair, and on the floor, a teddy bear with a deformed face. On a shelf, a cassette tape labeled by hand, HM. Back in the ward, Isaac found a portable recorder in the recreation room. He pressed play with trembling fingers. The tape hissed. Then a voice emerged, weak, tearful, like a whisper fighting forgetfulness. "If she ever hears this, tell her I didn't leave her." Isaac recognized the voice instantly. It was Helena, before time erased her face. In the days that followed, Isaac grew restless. He carried the tape with him, unsure what to do. He watched Helena from afar, noting every restrained gesture, every fixed stare at something no one else could see. He sensed this woman held something the hospital had tried to bury, but that still pulsed beneath the surface. A troubling certainty grew with each shift. This wasn't just a relapse. It was a memory too painful to fade on its own. Isaac no longer saw Helena as a patient. He saw her as the central piece in an old secret, and something told him more doors still needed opening. Isaac began visiting the decommissioned wing during his shift breaks, searching each corner like someone chasing a nameless truth. He found moldy folders, incomplete medical files, and a shelf of torn papers. Among them, a yellowed sheet with handwritten notes. Helena M. was scribbled beside violently crossed-out words, retention, isolation, confidential. One detail stood out. The handwriting matched a form he had seen days earlier, linked to a former nurse. Her name was Evelyn Kerr. She had disappeared from the hospital months after Helena's estimated delivery. No notice, no resignation. Isaac felt he had found the first piece of a buried puzzle. Using restricted access to the old system, he searched for any link between Evelyn and outside institutions. He found an address associated with a charitable congregation in Northbrook, 3 hours away. Evelyn had volunteered there briefly. The dates aligned with her abrupt departure from the hospital, and the congregation's name appeared in papers related to informal adoptions. On a gray Sunday, Isaac drove to the small town. The congregation's building was closed, but he met a former staffer at a nearby market who remembered Evelyn. She confirmed that a young woman had left a baby there. No documents, just a plea. Care for her as if forgotten. The child was given a new name and sent to a nearby orphanage. The orphanage still operated, now under new management. Isaac made up an excuse and gained partial access to old records. He found a hand-filled form with minimal data and a faded photo of a wide-eyed girl surrounded by donated toys. Her name was Sarah Whitmore. Date of birth, the day after the blackout at Waverly Hospital. Sarah had stayed in the institution until 18, then left to study in another city. She had worked in libraries, lived alone, and never searched for her past, perhaps out of fear or simply not knowing where to begin. Isaac wrote down her current address and paused. He wasn't sure he had the right to cross that line. Back home, he listened to Helena's tape again. Her voice, fragile and full of hope, now seemed meant for someone very specific. Isaac realized it wasn't about proof. It was about giving someone the chance to hear it and choose what to do with the pain. The next morning, he went to the address. It was a modest house, with potted plants on the porch and books stacked in the window. Sarah greeted him with cautious kindness. He told only part of the story. A hospital patient believed she had a daughter left anonymously at a congregation more than 20 years ago. Sarah listened in silence. It was a silence that knew itself. Isaac asked for nothing. He just left an envelope with the tape and a note. "Maybe you'd like to listen." Then he walked away without looking back. Sarah held the envelope for several minutes before going inside. In that still gesture was more than curiosity. There was something ancient, like an absence finally given shape. Days later, Isaac returned to the hospital for another shift. As he crossed the rear courtyard, he saw a figure standing by the old wing. It was her, Sarah. She said nothing, just looked at him, then at the dusty window, before slowly walking toward Helena, who sat under the soft morning sun. Sarah sat beside Helena like someone approaching a past that had always been nearby but never had a name. There was no explanation, no announcement, just presence, whole, alive, impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, something began to shift in Helena. The silences that once drowned her now made room for clearer phrases, more organized memories. For the first time in many years, she slept through the night. She woke without fear. She walked the corridors without looking back. Doctors, perplexed, began writing in their reports words they hadn't used in decades: stability, reconnection, clarity. Isaac knew what they didn't. This wasn't clinical progress. It was the truth coming home. And with it, the woman who had always been there, just buried beneath silence. After 2 weeks, Helena was discharged for good. She left the hospital with a small suitcase, an envelope of papers, and the serene look of someone finally returning to herself. She moved in with Sarah in a modest house on the city's outskirts, where they planted mint and spent afternoons reading in silence. They didn't speak of the past every day, but the past was there, present in the small things. In tea served with care, in a tune hummed absent-mindedly, in a cassette tape kept in the bottom drawer of the bookshelf, never played again, but never thrown away. Over time, Helena recovered not just her sanity, but her intimacy with life. She returned to writing, cooking, walking the neighborhood on her own. She rented a small house next to Sarah's, and they began sharing gardens, visits, silences, and sunny Sundays as if stitching together a new time, without haste, without guilt. Some scars never fade, but they stop hurting when someone chooses to stay. And that's how Helena, at last, learned to live again, not because she was healed, but because, after so long, she was finally seen. You don't always have to understand everything to move on. Sometimes, you just need to listen to what's always been there, waiting for attention. If this story found a place in you, consider following our channel. There are still many silences hoping to become presence.